All right, David, I know we only have you for an hour, so I'd love to just dive in. Hello, all, and welcome to Demon Live, election night, debates, conventions, producing the 2024 election with David Reiter. I'm thrilled to see so many people here joining us this evening um, for what's going to be a great conversation about election news coverage. Feel free to join us on camera if you'd like, and please use the chat to ask any questions that you would like me to ask David, though I can't promise to get to every question as there is so much to talk about surrounding this election and David's experience through over 20 years of working with special events for news organizations. With 8 Emmy Awards, 2 Peabody Awards, and 9 Murrow Awards, David, who is currently the Senior Vice President for CBS News 24/7 Special Events and Special Projects, is one of the industry's premier producers. We're so lucky that he's able to share an hour with us during what I can only imagine is one of the more hectic periods of time for him and his team, as there are less than 3 weeks to go till election night. So without further ado, welcome David Reiter to this Demon Live. David, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Of course. Before diving into election coverage, I'd love if you could share a little bit about your career path and journey to CBS News.
Sure. Good to see everybody. I was at, so I graduated in 1993 and I majored in economics and public policy, and I was sure I was going to go the business route, and then randomly ended up at ABC News, and then stayed there for 27 years, doing lots of different things at ABC. But probably was involved in my first election coverage in 1994, and then was lucky enough to cover Al Gore in 96, was sent to Florida in 2000 for that crazy election, and then in one way or another helped produce election night coverage every year since 2004. I joined CBS News about 3 years ago and produced our midterm coverage, but this will be my first presidential election at CBS News. For a long time, I did kind of news gathering, the input side of covering news, sending people out to cover breaking news and making sure that we have good reporting, we have good content, and we're getting to all our shows and platforms. I kind of moved later in my career to the output side, and now I produce just a lot of live breaking news coverage. This year has been a crazy year, everything from an eclipse to the conventions to the vice presidential debate just a few weeks ago. And then, as you said, sadly, less than 3 weeks, I wish it was longer, the election, which will be hopefully be fascinating. I just recently, about a month and a half ago, started overseeing our streaming channel. It's called CBS News 24/7. So that's another very interesting role, and hopefully of a strong future, I think, for news organizations as cable and broadcast television are fewer people are there, a lot more people in the streaming world, so they're trying to meet viewers where they are. Oh, you're muted, Eli.
Thank you. What an amazing career, David. Thank you so much for sharing and taking us through your journey. Do you have any memorable moments or stories from past elections that you want to share?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the 2000 election was fascinating. I was in Palm Beach County for the recount. Those of you who are old enough to remember hanging chads, I was like in the epicenter of hanging chads. I had a really amazing moment in 2008. ABC did their election coverage that year in Times Square, and we were in a production truck right on the street, on one of the side streets in Times Square. And so many people gathered there as Obama won the election. And it was an amazing night. We actually felt the ground moving because there were so many people. It must have been what it's like on New Year's. So that was a pretty amazing experience, just to be among that throng of people. That was pretty good. And then, of course, the election in 2020, when we realized late in the evening that we weren't going to be able to project who the next president was going to be, and that was the first time that's happened, at least in my memory, that we couldn't make the projection on the night of. And realizing that election night was going to stretch into election week, which was both us, I think just from a fatigue standpoint was, that was probably a really difficult thing. But we're now this year planning for the same thing, for election night to stretch into election days and maybe election week today.
Yeah, that's amazing. We have Janet in the chat who said that she was there in Times Square. So very cool. Everyone, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask David, please go ahead and throw them in the chat, and I can ask him. Now, overseeing election news coverage through the 21st century and the late 90s, you must have seen a lot of change in the industry. How have you seen the role of news media, specifically in elections, evolve over time?
It's interesting because the biggest thing you'll notice or viewers notice is the technology changes. You know, the way we display graphics, the way we get information, how easy it is to be live everywhere around the country. But the basic underpinnings of election night are pretty much, haven't changed that much. We gather vote count from around the country, either us or a consortium of news organizations, and then we have really smart people who are crunching the numbers and making projections. I think the biggest change over the last 3 election cycles, including this one, is until 2020, really, we didn't think a lot about the vote counting process when we were doing election coverage, and we didn't really have to spend a lot of time understanding how states voted, counted vote, when they counted vote, where it happened. Those things now are a central part of what we're doing. Understanding how all the key states, especially the 7 battleground states, how they count the vote, when they count the vote, because those things have been sadly weaponized. And the fact that the election may take a couple of days, we've spent a lot of time this election cycle and last election cycle trying to seed with our audience that a slow election results, slow vote count, and not having a result on election night, that doesn't mean anything's wrong. It's just a function of a close election and the fact that each state counts votes differently, and sometimes it takes a while.
Yeah, super, super interesting. Building off that evolution, we've obviously seen a massive change in new technology with phones and streaming platforms, the rise of AI and other emerging tech. How does that all impact your work?
I think, and it's not just for election coverage in general, for journalism, it used to be, something would happen and we had to get there and we were the eyes and ears gathering that information and getting it back to, New York or wherever your headquarters were. Now, that information is just everywhere. It's out there in the ether, and our job has become a little bit more separating the wheat from the chaff. There's always lots of stuff on social media, video, information, photos. So we've had to become much better at determining what is real, what is not real, authenticating video, photos, and information. That was less of a task in years before. I think the other big thing is every year the technology of displaying information gets better and better, with augmented reality and virtual reality. And I think one of the challenges I face, anyone who's producing an election faces, is making sure that we don't let the technology outpace the storytelling. Our job on election night is to deliver results and help explain to the audience, why those results happen. And if we focus too much on the technology and not enough on the storytelling, then I think we don't serve the audience well. So one of the things we spend a lot of time is figuring out the way we display election results. Is it adding to our storytelling and to the content, or is it distracting? Some of you may remember CNN tried to do holograms a few years ago. That was not a great success. That was probably an example of using technology for technology's sake. So we try to be very mindful of making sure that kind of the visual toolkit doesn't outstrip our storytelling capacity.
Awesome. Thanks, David. We're getting some questions in the chat, which is great. Some of these questions have to do with election logistics. So if anything is sort of out of your wheelhouse, just feel free to share. Patricia asks, is a large turnout in early voting beneficial to one party or the other in your experience?
Yeah, so we've had a few meetings about this in the last few days, talking to election experts and our own polling team. There are a lot of cross currents there. So our expectation is that a lot of people will vote early, but probably not as many as 2020. 2020 is kind of just, the weird year because of COVID. So many people voted early. We still think it will be a very high number, but probably not as many as 2020. Generally speaking, but it's hard to, for sure. But generally speaking, early vote has tended to trend more Democratic than Republican. It doesn't help Republicans that, Trump has given mixed messages on whether people should vote early or not, or trust mail voting. So generally, early vote will favor Democrats, and generally day of vote favors Republicans. One of the things we have to figure out is the vote gets counted different ways in different states. So in some states, that early vote will be counted first thing as soon as the polls close, and that's the first vote that we find out about. In other states, it's near the end of the vote that we find out about. So that's why we have election experts as part of our team, so that if one candidate is up with the early vote, let's say if there's 10% of the vote in a state, and one candidate is up by 7 or 8 percentage points, we will try to contextualize that and say, in this state, traditionally, candidates of that party generally, go out in the lead. They call that the red mirage or the blue mirage. And then there's often a correction as another type of vote comes in, and then the election gets closer. So that's why you'll see a lot of organizations, including CBS, put a rating on a race. So even with early vote in, it may show one candidate up versus the other, but our rating may show that the candidate that's losing is actually the one that's likely to win or leaning to win. And we have people who will explain why that is, that we believe the early vote that's been counted comes from counties that generally favor one party versus another, and our expectation that when other counties or big cities start to report their vote, that this will become a much tighter race.
Right. The actual vote night of makes sense to understand. As the votes come in, they're counted. Patricia asks, how are the polls done, given that so many people screen and ignore calls and texts?
So the exit poll really shouldn't be called the exit poll, it should be called the voter poll, because it's done in a few different ways. It's done the traditional way of like people standing outside polling places and talking to people after they voted on election day, but it's also done by phone polling in advance of people who have voted early. So it hopefully captures in an accurate way overall voters, people who voted early, people who voted by mail, and people who voted day of. I know a lot of people's faith in the exit poll has been shaken. We generally use the exit poll less to explain who's going to win and more to explain why they won. So if candidate X is winning, we will look at the exit poll and try to figure out which voting groups are favoring that candidate maybe more than the candidate of the same party from 4 years ago. So just as an example, if Donald Trump in a state is doing better with college educated voters than he did in 2020, that might be an indication of why he's winning that state. Or Kamala Harris is doing better with young voters than Joe Biden did in 2020. All of those kind of differences from the last election might be really interesting and important and help explain why one candidate might be winning versus another. So it's really we think about that the actual vote coming in and our statistical analyses is the what. The exit poll helps us explain why.
Great. Thanks, David. Hub asks, what can be done to counter disinformation and lies spread by social media? Can we help to educate children and the general population on media literacy and the difference between actual news media and social media, quote, influencers?
Yeah. Um, I mean, that's a great question. I think media literacy should be taught. It's a problem. Um, there is a ton of disinformation and misinformation out there. There's a real lack of trust in traditional news media, which is the problem for CBS and a problem for every broadcaster, but I think it's a societal problem. When we can't have kind of just basic facts that we can agree on, really hard to have an argument on the issues when you can't even agree what the bottom line issues are. So a couple of things that we do. I mentioned earlier, we have already started telling our audience, and we will repeat this a lot on election night, that we may not have a result on election night. And that's okay. Slow doesn't mean anything is wrong. It simply means that in a very close race, more vote has to get counted. And the actual counting of votes has always taken many days. But when if the races weren't that close, it was relatively easy for us to project, us and other news organizations to project the winner. It's much harder when it's a really close race. We have a team at CBS News that is solely focused on debunking misinformation and disinformation. And when we see something that might be really impactful, we will do that. We have a reporter on there whose really sole job is to focus on how democracy is working, what problems are arising, either with legal challenges or hopefully not, but violence or issues with polling places, disinformation and misinformation. But the goal, I think the best way for us from the media to dispel it is to work hard at telling the truth and be consistent about it. I do think there is an educational element to people understanding that there's a difference between, your sources of information and learning about, trying to understand, at least pay attention to where you're getting your information help. But we're in a crisis period in our country in terms of that, because that's not where we are right now. You're muted again. I know it's a good
Thanks,
question.
David. So in our call beforehand, you talked about running through all the scenarios, every graphic that's shown on TV. You have hundreds of variants so I know that you run through scenarios. Steve is asking, can you describe some of the scenarios where a candidate loses but refuses to accept the results, and how might that be covered?
Yeah. We definitely have had a lot of conversations here, and we will have more internal conversations about that scenario. And listen, I think we will make really clear that an election is decided by voters in states, and the person who wins is the person who gets enough votes in enough states to get over 270 electoral votes. And we in the media aren't the ones who decide who wins. Neither candidate gets to decide who wins. It's the voters. And the voters and the vote counting will take as long as it takes. And I think we will repeat a message like that often on election night, and we would repeat that message before and after any candidate who might come out and say otherwise. We'll also have to make an editorial decision in real time if we know a candidate's going to come out and say something that we know is not true, or declare victory or claim an election has been stolen. We will make a decision in real time about whether that's worth us carrying alive or not. That's a difficult decision to make, and I'm glad that's why I have bosses who get to tell me that. But we are discussing those kind of things a lot internally. Again, I think the best thing we can do, and any credible media organization can do, is to ensure that everyone in the country understands that vote counting is a long process, and there are definitely states where one candidate may jump out to a lead simply based on the process of vote counting in a particular state, but that doesn't mean that they're going to win. if you flip a coin 10 times and randomly 7 out of the first 10, you get heads, that doesn't mean that heads is going to win if you flip that coin 1,000 times. I don't know if that's a great analogy, but that is certainly one. So the best thing I think we can do is just to keep hammering home the truth.
Awesome. Thanks, David. Hub is asking, as we're all Dukies who lived in North Carolina for multiple years, do you have any insight into the key House, Senate, state legislature, governor, and presidential races in North Carolina? And it's interesting because due to some scandals, the North Carolina gubernatorial election is probably one of the most covered one this cycle.
That North Carolina governor's race is really the only one that we're really spending a lot of time on in terms of governor's races. It's really largely one of the only close races there. And because it's garnered national attention, we will spend some time focused on that race. See what happens. I do think that race, or North Carolina, might be a good example of a phenomenon that we'll be looking for: ticket splitting or ticket sitting, we call it, where I think it's very likely that Donald Trump will get a lot more votes than Robinson will in the state of North Carolina. We'll be able to compare that and show that either a lot of Republicans just didn't fill out their ballot for Robinson and did for Trump, or voted for Trump and voted for Robinson, the guy running against Robinson, Stein, right? That's many names in my head. I think the other really interesting thing about North Carolina this year is, of course, the hurricane and disaster relief and how that may impact voting in the state. And also, I mean, not only just the ability of people to vote, although I've heard that election officials in North Carolina have done a really good job in kind of allowing people to still vote in the heavily impacted areas. But it does open the potential for a lot of lawsuits after the fact. So those have been the two things that I've spent the most time paying attention to in terms of North Carolina. Although I did get a list of some of the key House races, and the North Carolina 1st District is one of the key House races that we'll be watching on election night. There's a pretty small universe of House races that will determine control of the House. We're between like 30 and 40 races, and that NC1 is one of the ones that we'll be watching closely that probably will help to determine, which party gets control of the House.
Yeah. Really interesting. Thanks, David. We're getting a ton of great questions in the chat. If anyone joined us recently, feel free to throw any questions in the chat that I can ask David. So Regina says that you mentioned CNN's holographic visuals. Do you watch competitors' coverage? How much does watching their coverage techniques influence you and CBS? You're reporting live, so it'd be hard to compare coverage in real time. Whereas if you're a movie producer, you can watch a competitor's movie at a more leisurely pace, right?
Well, that's a great question. I watch my competitors all the time. Like I like to see how they're handling stuff, how they're doing graphics, almost everything they're doing. And so like I've watched everybody's midterm coverage, all my competitors, so ABC, NBC, MSNBC, CNN, Fox. I'd like to see just what they did, and if they've had, I'm not above stealing a good idea or a good look or something like that from my competitors. Yeah, on election night, I'm barely watching them at all. In fact, I don't really want to know, for the most part, what they're projecting and whether they're faster or slower than us. I'm just really focused on our show. I do have some people. One of my concerns on election night is not losing the forest for the trees. I'm really focused on what are we doing now? What are we doing next? I need to make sure that there's some people who are just focused on the big picture. And so for the midterms, for an example, it was important to have people tell me, this is not looking as bad for Democrats as many people thought it would. And that's where I need someone who's really just paying attention to the big picture, also seeing what others are doing. So I hope that helps, but I pay attention to what they do all the time.
So cool. I really appreciate your stamina, David. I imagine you had a full day today and every day. So Mimi asks, what are your priorities in election coverage between now and election day, or as you say, election week,
Yeah.
or
So we're kind of now in a period of rehearsals. So I was telling Eli before, this week is a lot of technical rehearsals in our studio, looking at graphics, looking at our augmented reality, our virtual reality. I it's a very we have an ambitious plan. And so the first layer of rehearsals are the technical rehearsals. Next week, I will get in there and really look at everything, see what works, see what doesn't work, what we would do kind of together. Like if I'm in one area, can I go to another area next, or does that not work? Either in terms of the camera shots or the graphics don't look good. Excuse me. And then a week after that, a few days before the election, we get the real talent in, so they get comfortable with their places in the studio and they know where they're looking and they get to interact with the graphics. There are a number of our on-air team who are interacting pretty closely with technology, like a guy who's in a green screen area and a couple of people at a touch screen. They have already started rehearsing. There's nothing worse than someone who really knows their stuff but is not comfortable with their technology, and then they, again, they lose the technology, kind of kills the storytelling. So we have to make sure that they're really ready to go. The other thing I was telling you earlier, I have like a book filled with things that I just need to make sure we've taken care of. Do we have graphics for all the possible things that may come up? Do I have on-air people who are ready to talk about any of the things that may come up? And I will spend the next 2 weeks kind of running down that list, checking things off, adding new things. And then the other big thing is really making sure my anchor, who's Nora O'Donnell, that she and I are as mind melded as possible, because obviously if it's in my head but not in her head, that's not great for our show. So I've talked to her multiple times a day.
yeah. We're getting really great questions in the chat. Thank you all who are providing these questions. A great question from Alexander that I've always wondered. Can you speak more to the states that are too close to call and the incentives that different news organizations have in calling it before other news orgs? And what's the chain of command for calling these difficult states?
Yeah. So we're really heavily focused on the 7 battleground states, and I'm pretty sure pretty much everybody has the same 7, North Carolina being one of them. So we, like most, I could tell you ABC is this way and CBS, the 2 places I've worked. Our decision desk, which is where these races are projected one way or the other, or not projected, they are an independent organization. I have no sway over when they project the race. They are also not informed of what competitors are doing. We purposely do not tell them so they don't feel pressure. And I am essentially a client of their work. I wait for them to make a projection and then I go on the air with it. And so, unlike other news organizations, we, the guy who runs our decision desk, his name is Anthony Salvanto, he appears on air. We think that's good transparency, and so that we can tell the audience not only the projected, but here's the guy who projected it, and he'll explain why. We think that's a good. We think that's. I think the audience likes that kind of level of transparency, and so we think that's a differentiator for us. So obviously there will be people who will be saying in my ear, this network just called this race. There's really nothing I can do other than be like, okay, they did. I don't think in the scheme of things, anybody remembers for the most part who called state X 5 minutes before, us, or who we call 5 minutes before someone else. I think that's one of those internal things that doesn't really make a difference to the audience, as long as we're competitive, which I think we are. That's really the most important thing.
Yeah. How different is the work that you do, both prep and live, for known events like the conventions and the debates versus breaking news and everything that happens during election night?
Yeah. Um, they're not that dissimilar. We rehearse a lot, so that nobody, my director, me, our anchor, our talent, hopefully none of them are experiencing something for the first time that we've kind of gone through. Like, so I'll give you an example for the debate. We rehearsed both candidates yelling at each other, both candidates yelling at the moderators, both candidates not stopping when their time was up. In the end, it was none of that really happened. And in fact, to such a point, I guess we've gotten so used to crazy debates that I turned to my boss in the control room about 20 minutes in, and I said, "Oh my God, this is going to be a real debate." I don't think we prepared for that. So we, on all those things in a convention, for example, we have a sense of what their order of, their what they're going to do and the order they're going to do it, but we don't get scripts in advance. They often will have surprises. Oprah coming out at the DNC was not something we knew about, and they dropped some hints, but we didn't know. That last night at the convention, for anyone who watched it, there were all these rumors that Taylor Swift was going to come out or Beyonce was going to come out. I mean, we truly did not know until the night was over that neither one of them was going to come out. I think the big difference is there are events like a convention, a debate where at least we know where all of our cameras are. Like I know who the team is. I know all the resources that we have. We can prepare lots of historical information. You can also do that for an election night. The thing on election we don't know are those unpredictable things that may happen. A problem in a state or a polling place. Hopefully not, but violence, legal challenges. We're talking about and making sure we have a process for if those things happen and impact the vote. And in addition to covering them, that we'll be able to make smart decisions of does that in any way impact whether we can project the state or not. And if it is, we're going to be transparent with the audience to say there's a reason why we can't project this state, and it's because there's just too much uncertainty.
Yeah.
And then we'll have to wait for state election officials to tell us what's going on.
I'm glad that you brought up the vice presidential debate. CBS News had the privilege of hosting this year's most recent and final debate between vice presidential candidates Tim Walz and JD Vance. You were there. I've seen some cool behind the scenes photos. What was it like prepping for and producing this event?
I think the first thing I'll tell you is, unlike the last 30 or 40 years, there used to be the Commission on Presidential Debates, which would do the general election debates. And this year, both candidates, for various reasons, said they didn't want to go with them. So it was a really kind of a Wild West scenario where all the news divisions were basically essentially vying to get debates. So the hardest part of the debate was actually getting the debate. And eventually we just went public with the fact that we had invited the candidates to a debate on a certain date at a certain time in New York. And that actually got us across the finish line. It was very exciting. It was great to host a debate. I think it went well. I do think, again, the weaponization of stuff that really shouldn't be weaponized, like fact checking, was something we had to pay attention to a lot. And I think more than the American public really deserved. The debate should not be about the moderators or the rules. A debate should truly be about an exchange of ideas, and so that voters get a chance to size up candidates. And I do think there's just a lot of distraction out there in the world, unfortunately. It was a great experience. I got to meet both VP candidates when they did their walkthrough. They were both, very nice. And in the end, I thought we had a pretty successful debate.
Absolutely. And this debate was a little unique. It had no audience, and you cut their mics off. You said you were a bit surprised at how cordial it was. It really felt like a sort of old school debate, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was a little surprised. both candidates and their teams, when they came in, made a point to tell us how they were going to follow the rules, and they had a lot of questions about the rules. And I was very transparent with them about the three scenarios where we would cut their mics, which is if someone just wouldn't stop talking when their time was up, or if they were yelling at each other to the point where no one could understand what they were saying, or if someone was just interrupting the other speaker. And we only exercised that one time during the debate. I thought was great. And then the rest of it was like a really interesting exchange. I thought an interesting exchange of ideas. And our strategy was, if somebody said something that we thought stretched the truth, we were gonna try to let the other candidate do the fact checking work. Because it's supposed to be a debate between those two folks, and I think we accomplished something.
Yeah, it was great. So great job. We've got just over 20 minutes left. Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you especially to David. Seth asks, could you say a bit more about what topics are coming up in your pre-production meetings for this year's election night? I'm also curious how you balance your job as a producer to create compelling coverage with the reality that you likely won't have a final result that night, like you said.
Yeah. So we're having a lot of discussions on some basic stuff. For instance, who is going to be in our studio and what are their lanes, their editorial lanes. We're still honing that. Who are we going to have in the field and where are they going to be in the field? It's a little easier this year because there's only those 7 battleground states, so we're going to know we're going to put people in all of those states. We have another layer of coverage around the country, which are, where do we think there might be problems or conflict? So that's a whole nother layer of coverage where we're sending people to make sure that we have eyes and ears in places where we think we need to be. We're still having lots of discussions on what guests we might want to book, again, based on what may or may not happen across the night. So that's big. I think one of the challenges has been, if this election stretches beyond election night into election week, we're going to go into a 12 hours on, 12 hours off scenario where we've actually named our teams. We've got a green team and a yellow team, and my team is the yellow team. Our executive producer of our morning show runs the green team, and essentially we will just hand off to each other. So I will take it through the overnight. The green team will take over at 6 in the morning, and we'll stay on the air most likely until my team takes over again at noon the day after the election. And we'll keep going back and forth like that until the election's over. So that presents a challenge. That presents just a logistical challenge and a psychological challenge and a sleep challenge. But I think we're prepared for it. Just to answer the other part of the question, the scenarios. We just have I'm looking at my list. We have a ton of conversations about what if we know Trump is going to win. We need to have a lot of topics ready to discuss of what a Trump administration would look like. Politics, policy, personnel. And the same in the opposite direction. If we think Harris is going to win, we need to have a lot of discussions teed up about what will that mean for policy, politics, and personnel. If one party is going to control Congress and the White House, we need to have some topics ready for that. If it's divided government, we have to have stuff ready to discuss. So a lot of our prep are what are the potential storylines that come out of the evening or the days, and make sure that we've assigned people to be in charge of that we've created graphics or have video that will help support the conversations that we're going to have. That's a lot of what we're doing now, is going through the scenarios. One of the things I read the other day, which is certainly possible, is that there might be a triple flip. For the first time in U.S. history, the party in charge of the presidency, the House, and the Senate may flip, and that's never happened before. And so, or it's never happened during a presidential election. The party, each of those 3 areas change control. So if that happens, that'll be a really interesting thing for us to talk about.
Yeah, fascinating. The green and yellow teams, Were those colors chosen at random, or is there any significance?
Yeah. No, there's no significance. The only significance is like we didn't want to call it like the A or the B team because I didn't, we didn't want the B team to think they weren't the A team. And we couldn't be the red or the blue team for obvious reasons. So we just picked green and yellow.
Yeah. Speaking of A, B, C, we've got a great question from Lily. Some people have plan A, B, and C. As you're talking about rehearsals for the election, I'm wondering how far down the alphabet you guys go. How many contingency plans are there?
Um, at some point, I feel like we have diminishing returns and we only have so much time to rehearse. So what I don't like to do, people are different about this. I don't like rehearsing um, too much a specific like outcome. I mean, we use fake data when we do rehearsals, so the graphics actually have some numbers in them, and we'll mix and match it. But I don't want my anchors or the on-air talent to start building like synapses in their brain of like, oh yeah, this is what's going to happen. So we try to mix it up and not get too down into the weeds of, this candidate has won Georgia, and so what does that mean? Because I don't want them to feel like, oh, this is what's going to happen on election night. So we will generally rehearse. If we rehearse Georgia going for one candidate on one day, we'll rehearse Georgia going for the other candidate the next day. A lot of the permutations are the things we've talked about. Like, what are we going to do if we know we're at midnight or 11 at night that there's no way we're going to project the presidential race and we've got 3 or 4 more hours to cover? What are we going to do? There's plenty to talk about, and we've got lots of great people, but it becomes a different show than if we're talking about from 11 o'clock on what the next presidency is going to look like. So we have to be prepared to tell a story like that, or we have to be prepared to tell a story of we are laser focused on those 3 or 4 or 5 remaining battleground states, and we're going to dig really deep into how the votes getting counted in those states, to our reporters in those states, to what the exit poll is telling us about those states, and what are the paths to victory for the 2 candidates based on the results we have. So we basically have to be prepared for 2 very different kind of stories that we tell across so many hours on the air.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And the data piece is interesting as well. We've got a question from Regina. Can you please tell us about your research team and how that research is presented to the on-air team? There
Yeah.
must be an enormous library of research and stats and things that you collect.
Yeah. So we put together what we call like our research book, which is, many over 100 pages. One of the challenges, and I work with the producers for the different, or our anchors and our talent, is how do we like turn that into kind of bite-sized chunks? So ultimately, we will take that research book and get it down into kind of essentially index cards that might be for each race. For each state will have an index card. Each poll closing time will have an index card. The various potential storylines or scenarios will have an index card. That thing I mentioned, the potential triple flip, which I doubt we'll know on election night, but sometime we'll know, that will have an index card. And on that card will be historical research, interesting nuggets, and then which of the on-air team or multiple people are the ones to go to talk about that thing. And so one of the things I was doing tonight was going down that list and making sure that certain on-air talent knew that if this topic comes up, they're going to be the first ones that, Nora O'Donnell goes to talk about that. And so having that prepared is really important for us. Some things I call it a progression. If we project a state, especially one of the battleground states, there's about 7 or 8 things that we will do after we make that projection. Of course, we're going to want to talk to some of our, what I call them wise people in the studio about what a big deal that is. We're going to want to go to our reporter in the state. We're going to want to go to our head of polling about why ultimately they were able to project the state, like what it was. Usually that means a new tranche of vote came in and they were able then to essentially make that projection. We're going to want to talk to our guy doing exit polls about, you know, which groups of voters helped that candidate win the state. We want to go to the guy who basically has the game we call path to victory. But if a battleground state goes to a certain candidate, that will, for that candidate, increase their potential path to victory and decrease it for the other one. So we will go through all those. So we'll rehearse a lot those progressions so that everybody, not just the on-air talent, but their producers, my graphics team, the video team, they'll kind of, that we built up some muscle memory. So when we do a projection, we pretty much know what, you know, the order of what we're going to go in.
This election, like all elections, will certainly have a ton of ramifications, not just domestically, but for the world. A question from Alondra: how does election coverage capture the sentiments and interests of foreign nations?
Yeah.
It seems like many countries are closely following and invested in this particular election, considering its impact on foreign policy. How is this reflected in the media, and how is it balanced with domestic coverage?
It's interesting. For our debate, we had dozens of international broadcasters who wanted to come to debate and cover it. From places I never thought would want to come cover it. I thought that was interesting. We partner with the BBC, and they're kind of embedded with us during election night. There's a lot of interest. I think there are multiple answers to that. I think one of them is that we will talk about on election night how a win for either candidate, what impact that will have on foreign policy, what impact that will have on national security. There are huge international crises that we're in the middle of, Ukraine and Israel and others. So, and these candidates are pretty different in how they plan to go about foreign policy in those areas. NATO, climate change. I mean, all of those are areas that we'll want to discuss, and where the two candidates have big differences. I do think, you know, our audience, our main job is to serve our audience, is mainly domestic, and we want to make sure that we keep the focus on the things that we know our audience wants us to pay attention to, and that is a laser focus on results, good analysis as to why people voted the way they did, or why one candidate is winning or another, and then, like I said, to make sure that if interesting storylines are emerging, that we're on top of them and that we're explaining them. But beyond the control, who is the White House and who controls the House and the Senate, like what are the results telling us about where America is going, or where the majority of America is going? I think we're seeing a huge realignment of the political parties in terms of who is the party that represents the working class, who is the party that represents wealthier Americans. There's a huge realignment. Which party do voters like Hispanic voters or Black voters, you know, where do they vote? There's a really big realignment going on. And I think part of our job on election night is to help explain that. First of all, let people know what's happening, show the data to support it, and then explain, if we can, why it's happening.
Yeah. So interesting. We've got 10 minutes left. Thank you so much, David. Really interesting responses to all these questions. We're going to take a few more questions from the chat, and then we've got a few to close us out. This question from Janet, she asks, what kind of experts help advise you on where conflict may arise or what issues may arise in certain states? Is it the reporters informing you so that you can then inform the reporters? It sounds like a chicken egg situation.
Yeah, I mean, we have lots of sources. So we work really closely with our CBS stations in these states. So we're talking a lot with them. And, you know, they live in these places. As I mentioned earlier, we've got some couple of people who are really experts on the mechanics of elections, you know, how voting is done, how vote counting is done, who have good relationships with the Secretary of States and all these states. They're helping us figure out where we need to be. We do have a pretty good roadmap in 2020 to understand the places that we think could be points of conflict geographically. Some of these major counting centers in cities like Philadelphia, Milwaukee, Detroit, Atlanta, that were flashpoints 4 years ago, will be stationed at those places in case they become flashpoints again. We know some of the counties in these battleground states that were flashpoints 4 years ago, or that there's just been developments over the last couple of years that we're paying close attention to as well. And and then, we have people in our political unit who've been crisscrossing the country and visiting these states, and we rely a lot on them to help guide what we should be talking about, where we should be going. So that's really, I think I mentioned, we have an entire democracy watch team of people who handle misinformation and disinformation. Like I said, it will be our eyes and ears across lots of the country, and reporting into us in New York and getting that on the air. We never did that 8 years ago or prior to that. That's really a relatively new development, and it speaks to the weaponization of the voting process that we've seen over the last 8 years.
I really appreciate you taking us through a lot of the logistics of this news coverage, not just for CBS, but whole election coverage. Turning to a sort of lighter note, I'm wondering if you could share some of your favorite parts of your job, and if you prefer election season, or we'll call it the off season.
For my life, I prefer the off season more than election season. Election nights they're challenging. They're really challenging. My favorite part of the debate was right when it ended. My favorite part of election night will be right when it ends. It's cool, but more than cool, it's really an honor to be able to create history in real time. Like that, lots of people are watching, and to get to be part of the process. And a successful show, no matter what kind of show it is, right? News, sports, a drama, it's a combination. A lot of things have to come together and work. And it's a bit of a brain teaser to make sure that, we've prepared well, we've got the right look, we've got the right talent, we've got people in the right places. And if it all goes well, that's actually for us, it's pretty exciting. So I do like the off season, although there's always other stuff. Like today, we had to spend many hours, doing that story about the Israel getting the head of Hamas. So that distracted us for about 4 or 5 hours today, and we had to make some television around that. So that's one of those examples of things that were kind of an unplanned thing that we had to race to do. I hope that answered that question. It's both fun and a little nerve-wracking, but I guess that it stays interesting.
Oh, well, thank you so much, David, for being here tonight. This has been really informative and amazing to hear you talk about all the great work you do. For the final question of the evening, I don't know how many students we have in the audience, but this will be available on YouTube, and people may be watching this for years to come. Do you have any advice for students or young graduates who are trying to break into news media?
Yeah. It is a challenging business right now, from a business perspective. Doesn't mean don't do it. But it is challenging. I would say that the profession of journalism has changed a lot in terms of what you need when you're starting out versus when I was starting out many, many years ago. You can no longer kind of just be like, okay, I just want to do X, and I don't care about the other aspects of it. Anyone coming into television journalism, it will help if you know how to pick up a camera and shoot your own video, if you know how to edit video. Those things have become much more democratized than they were when I started out. You also have to be willing and able to understand how storytelling is different for different outlets, whether it's television versus web versus social, and if you don't know that, be willing to learn that. I think being a journalist these days means you have to be kind of a jack of all trades. So my biggest advice after all that preamble would be, first of all, if you're interested in doing it, it almost doesn't matter what your first job is. You just want to kind of get into the business. I think a lot of journalism is about, are you the kind of person that other journalists want to work with? And then once you're in the door, just building relationships. No matter what job you do, you're going to pick up skills and experiences that will help you get the next job. I say this to young people at CBS, and I said it at ABC. If you think of it as a marathon, at some point, like a really good job that you want, 10 years into your career will come up, and do you have the foundation so that you're ready for that job? And that foundation is built on whatever your earlier experiences are. Like, do you understand how to produce content? Have you worked on an assignment desk so you kind of get how, how news gets covered? Have you worked at a show so you know how to put a show together? Almost doesn't matter what role you had at those things, but if you could tell a good story about how you're prepared for that next challenge, I think that helps. So I know it's a long-winded answer, and probably not exactly, I'll tell you a quick little fun story. That the reason I got my job at ABC is because I happened to be shoveling snow at my parents' house, and the guy across the street worked at ABC, and I gave him my resume. So I guess my biggest, and I say this sarcastically, it's not what you know, it's who you shovel snow near, that will get you your job. So that's how I got mine. So I'm probably a bad example, but take any job you possibly can, because any experience you get will help you get the next job you're in.
That's really great advice. Thank you, David. So in short, find who you want to work for, shovel snow near them, hand them a resume. It could work.
Exactly.
That's all the time that we have here tonight. Thank you all so much for joining us for this Demon Live and the incredible questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all. David, this has been just an absolute treasure. I hope we get to do this again sometime, maybe in the off season or maybe 2 or 4 years from now. Please go out and vote. Tune into CBS News during election night to see in action all the cool stuff David has shared with us. David, thank you. Good luck over the next few weeks and be well.
Thank you all. Thanks for being here.
Good night, everybody.